Okay, colleagues, I think let's start. It's now 1:05. I would like to welcome you in this session of the PCC. Today, we're going to be looking at the mitigation component of the NDC recommendations. My name is Brian Mantlana. I'm one of the commissioners in the PCC. I work at the CSIR, where I lead climate and air quality. Thank you for making the time to join us this afternoon. As I mentioned earlier, the objective of today is to strengthen a shared understanding of the mitigation pillar in the NDC process. It's also to provide a platform for evidence-based dialogue and an inclusive feedback. We want to make sure that the recommendations that we are sending forward reflect local realities, climate science, and South Africa's fair contribution to global climate action. So with that reminder, colleagues, I request that we start our session. You've already seen the agenda. We're scheduled to be here until 3 o'clock. We're going to try to do that. First, on our list of inputs, I want to invite Ms. Lebogang to give us a framing of this conversation and to put it into context what exactly this session is going to be about. Please come in, Lebo.
Thank you, Commissioner Mantlana, and thanks to everyone that has taken the time to join us today to look at the mitigation-specific chapter of the PCC's NDC recommendations that the PCC is currently in the process of developing and refining as an input to the DFFE process. We have to always make it clear that the PCC is not the ones that are drafting an NDC update for South Africa. This is the sole responsibility of the DFFE. The PCC's role is to, through the process of extensive public consultation that has taken place since the end of last year, to get stakeholder views as much as possible, will feed in as an input into the DFFE process once we have finalized the PCC recommendations report and we hand it over to the DFFE, as well as make recommendations to the President of the Republic, who is the chair of our commission. So just to say that this report that we are looking at more broadly, and the mitigation section that we're going to be having conversations about and seeking inputs for, is meant to guide the DFFE NDC for the 2030 and 2035 period. It is important to note that this process is indeed grounded in the principles of procedural, distributive, as well as restorative justice. These are important for the Presidential Climate Commission, hence the extensive stakeholder process that we have undertaken and we are still undertaking until we are in the process to finalize recommendations. Therefore, these recommendations aim to align South Africa's international commitments with domestic development priorities, legal obligations under the Climate Change Act, as well as the pressing socio-economic imperatives for our country. Setting an NDC requires dedicated resources, inclusive and whole of society engagement and consultation, better integration across government departments, and alignment with sectoral emissions targets and the low emissions development strategy, the LEDs, as well as the SEDs. These are vital for shaping South Africa's future economy and should be treated as a national priority, which should be subjected to processes of open public engagement. It is important for the NDC to reflect South Africa's evolving climate governance landscape. It must also take into account the pace and the affordability of the transition, considering energy security and sustainable economic growth. As the PCC, we do accept that you can transition too fast, but you can also transition too slow. Both cases having significant but different economic and social impacts. However, when managed correctly, the NDC does present an opportunity to decarbonize existing sectors, gradually phasing out sectors that will cease to be more competitive and do the hard work of introducing sectors that will create opportunities for employment. The Climate Change Act and the Just Transition Framework provide the legal and policy foundation for ensuring that the shift to a low carbon economy is fair, inclusive, and supportive of vulnerable communities as well as workers. Given the escalating climate risks, trade and finance pressures, and domestic inequalities, the 2030 to 2035 NDC update should reflect South Africa's just economic transformation. It must balance local realities with global expectations, clearly outline policy intentions, and assign responsibilities across the various spheres of government. I'd also want to clearly state that making a decision about an NDC is ultimately a political one. However, the Climate Change Act introduces a shift. The legally binding greenhouse gas emissions trajectory will be gazetted by the minister, with the NDC serving as a transparent communication instrument for the domestic and international stakeholders. The existing body of research evidence shows that a climate-compatible transition is both possible and desirable, but not everything can be modeled. We must pave the way for a just transition towards a low carbon and climate resilient economy. The existing body of work, which will be spoken about more in the next presentation, by the ESRG, which are located within UCT, suggests that a national carbon budget ranging from 8 to 9 gigatons is a no-regret option considering our fair share contributions and economic benefits. And this represents a no-regret choice informed by updated national modeling consistent with well below 2-degree pathways and remaining mindful of the national capacity and economic recovery needs. Having said that, Chair, thank you very much. These are my initial framing for the remainder of the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Lebu, for helping us to locate and position this document in the context of what I consider an ever-evolving governance landscape of climate change in South Africa. Now I want to invite Simphiwe Ngwenya, also from the Secretariat, to give us the main points on the draft recommendations in the mitigation component. Please come in, Simphiwe.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you, Lebakang, for that intro. I think it sets the scene really well. Good afternoon, everyone. As Brian has, or Commissioner Mantlana, excuse me for the formalities, as indicated, my name is Simphiwe Ngwenya and I'm a senior manager in the mitigation team. So I will be presenting on the mitigation component from our NDC recommendations. Just to note that we did receive some support in terms of the technical analysis from the Meridian team, particularly Brett and Emily. They also are on the call with us, but I will go through the presentation and provide, it is, I guess, a high-level summary of what is contained in the recommendations report, but also allow time for reflections as well as discussion later on. So before I go into the presentation, I think it's very important for us to really understand our initial recommendations. South Africa's first updated NDC that was submitted in 2021. This follows the update of the intended nationally determined contributions that were, of course, submitted by the DFFE. And particularly just to really hone in with regards to the year 2030 and the targets that were set for 2026 to 2030, and that we had set the target range in terms of the lower bound of our NDC or emissions commitments to be 350 and the upper bound to be 420 megatons CO2e. It is noted really that this upper range, the upper end of the 2030 target, it lies within the fair share range, while the lower end is aligned with 1.5 degree assessment based on the different tools and the models that were used for assessment at the time. And moreover that, the period leading up to 2030 has to be characterized by decarbonization.
Yeah.
I
want to talk to you, but I'm supposed to be presenting on a webinar. Is there some place I can plug in for better internet? Because my webinar keeps...
Okay. All right, cool. The technology. All right. The period leading up to 2030 has to be characterized by decarbonization of the electricity sector and the need for the implementation then of the 2019 IRP because of the investment in renewables requirements. And the mitigation component in that NDC also noted the importance of pursuing decarbonization in the context of the just transition. And this is the base or the baseline from which we work from. And so with regards to the recommendations for 2030 to 2035, the PCC will at first reflect on whether the 2030 target range is still appropriate and sufficiently ambitious. This is in light of what has happened both domestically and internationally since that target range was established. And so there are several factors that have to be considered. We've since really experienced the COVID-19 pandemic that has had dire consequences in terms of, economic growth locally and even globally. We've had extensive load shedding and also just low levels of economic activity, largely because of the former. But in parallel, we've had growth of grid renewable energy. We've seen increased installation of behind-the-meter solar capacity. But from the UAE consensus, there's also a strong call to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. We will then make a proposal with regards to the target range for the 2035 emissions trajectory, as well as present reflections on the sector level mitigation considerations. And so to revisit our 2030 target range. To do this, we have drawn extensively from the study that the PCC commissioned by the UCT ESRG. Lebo has spoken about this, but we also cross-reference, existing data from the Climate Action Tracker, as well as the Climate Equity Reference Calculator. The ESRG group at UCT explored the implications of different carbon budgets, net zero dates, and other assumptions for emissions trajectories and mitigation across different scenarios. I have mentioned that this data is cross-correlated with the latest data from Climate Action Tracker, as well as the Climate Equity Reference Calculator. And so we considered the study really well suited because to inform the recommendations, because it includes recent data. It has been developed by a well-respected research institution, and it also includes pathways relevant to this document. Just to also note that the DFFE is using an updated data set for their analysis of the NDC, which is also the modeling was done by UCT. And one thing to note is that neither outcome of retaining, of keeping the range or lowering the target range should affect the setting of our 2035 NDC emissions range. And so to reflect on the 2030 target range, we have spoken about, the data sets. So what this data indicates is that a 2030 NDC fair range by the ESRG data would be between the range of 325 and 373 megatons CO2e. This is the lower bound and the upper bound respectively. and the climate action tracker figures would sit us at 320 megatons CO2e, while CIRC would position us at 309 as well as 329 megatons CO2e. But the analysis indicates that the 2030 NDC is higher than the country's fair share contribution towards the current international policy position of pursuing an ambitious NDC or progressive NDC that would contribute towards the UAE consensus and limiting temperature rise to 1.5 globally. But as I've said, South Africa faces a variety of trade-offs when evaluating whether the 2030 targets should be revised as part of the 2030 to 2035 NDC. And some of the trade-offs I have spoken about, I did mention in the previous slide, it's largely because of socio-economic growth. And so we might, want to keep the 2030 target range as it is, to allow for economic recovery and growth in the short to medium term. And so a further analysis is that, that's the point around the slide. We might want to really just keep the 2030 target as it is to allow some room for economic growth and recovery. And so with regards to the 2030 to the 2035 NDC range, this is mostly the last column that I am referring to. Before I go into the slides, I want to note that when we were having our consultations and engagements, there was some divergence on the level of ambition and feasibility of implementation. In particular, Labour and some parts of government noted that this range should not exacerbate job losses, in particular in the vulnerable regions, and that too ambitious a target might exacerbate socio-economic inequality if not paired with clear mitigation support and measures. And I think that's where the framing by Lebogang actually comes in that the NDC is really anchored around ensuring a just future as well as economic opportunities. And so, but in addressing the concerns about socio-economic impacts of imposing the different emissions constraints on the economy, consideration was given to the findings of the studies that seek to understand the implications of decarbonization for GDP. This is largely the ESRG work. And I do want to note that what the modeling and the studies do is that they do not factor in some externalities such as air pollution as well as water usage. So you might find that within the assumptions and the modeling range, the current range, if it were to factor in some of these externalities, we might find that it may not be as progressive as it is, as it could be because of impacts on the overall state health system. And so a carbon budget of 8 to 9 gigatons and a combination of long-term measures, especially energy efficiency measures, could support growth and mitigate some of the transition risks. But also equally important is the ability to access concessional finance as we transition, which could culminate from a progressive NDC. And so drawing on the ESRG model pathways of 8 and 9 gigatons CO2e, so this data suggests a 2035 emissions range of between 248 and 329 megatons CO2e in 2035. And so this represents the bounds of the fair share contribution to the global mitigation efforts. Whilst, again, just to emphasize that this range is obtained from this single study, it is aligned with findings from the other work that explores emissions levels that represent South Africa's 2035 fair share contribution to the global mitigation efforts. I think more than anything, because this is based off of a carbon budget, an overall carbon budget for South Africa leading to 2050, the bigger conversation to be had is around the carbon budget going forward. I also want to note that the ESRG report, as well as accompanying reports, are available on the PCC's website. And so we are now moving into the recommendations for inclusion of the sectoral considerations. And so with regards to the electricity supply, stakeholders differed on the role of certain technologies, for example, particularly just to mention gas and nuclear. But however, So the reasons that they differed on, some stakeholders really supported gas and nuclear because of perceived or of a more secure energy source, whilst other stakeholders opposed to it because of costs and elements such as procedural justice involved within the implementation of these technologies. Just to note that the report further elaborates that the work that has been done or analysis by the PCC and Meridian indicates that the electricity or power sector report indicates that gas usage, there is some gas within the system, but for peaking purposes, and nuclear is not factored in or is excluded because of cost. And so these sectors are, the key enablers. Just going into the further details around the build plan. The proposed build plan for renewables and batteries in the draft IRP 2024 that have been submitted to NEDLAC for renewables, particularly and batteries, falls within the range of the figures that have been suggested by both ESRG and Meridian Economics as enabling the achievement of a 2030 and a 2035 target range for the NDCs. So the PCC would support the inclusion of renewables and battery capacity expansion numbers contained within the draft of the IRP that has been submitted to NEDLAC. Of course, there would need to be accompanying factors such as the expansion of transmission infrastructure, as well as just ensuring that the increased renewables or penetration of renewables does not disadvantage the poor in terms of cost. However, it has to be noted that more work needs to be done to understand the coal and gas utilization rates. In particular, the type of gas is really important. But what is really key, what we are finding is that with regards to, the power sector, it is important to understand the utilization rate because it's about how much, or coal is actually consumed. But equally so, it is important to keep increasing the penetration of renewables for energy security purposes and just socio-economic factors along the value chain. With regards to transport, and so transport really one of the key is also key in terms of its emissions, but some of the transitional pressures that are faced that are imposed to us by our trade partners. And so one of the key decarbonization levers for transport includes electrification of the passenger and public transport fleet, as well as a shift from road to rail. But I just want to note that we should not lose sight of the options or the biggest just transition outcomes when decarbonizing transport. And so just important, the shift, from road to rail, but equally so, improved spatial planning so that we can overall reduce the need for travel. And so the PCC recommends that the NDC includes a formal commitment to implement the draft Transport Just Transition Plan that has been developed by the Department of Transport. So this draft Just Transition Plan has been circulated broadly with stakeholders by the DOT. It has also been consulted widely with stakeholders, even to the extent of doing regional consultations, particularly with those regions that are impacted in terms of transport. So this was mostly the Eastern Cape, it was Gqeberha, Durban, as well as Johannesburg. And so further to that, modeling and further analysis will be required for the implementation of the plan. And I think that's where the update of the green transport strategy does come in, because the department is looking to update the green transport strategy, but also equally so enhance some of the modeling efforts within there. And so with regards to industry, the opportunities for some emission savings do exist and are possible by 2035 through increased efficiencies, changes to existing configurations, and feedstock changes. And so it's recommended that this NDC really include a commitment to laying the groundwork for large-scale industrial decarbonization. And this is really going to be important with regards to setting sight of greening those hard-to-abate sectors. And so just to summarize the recommendations from the PCC, we do recommend for policy alignment amongst the long-term low emissions development strategy, the NDCs and the SETs, because our short-term visions really have to align with our long-term priorities and visions. And so the NDC target for 2030, it does not have to be changed, but maybe just to acknowledge that achieving well below this upper level of the NDC with both South Africa's fair share and contribution, and would position the country well for achieving the 2035 target comfortably. And we make the recommendations of a 2035 emissions range of between 248 and 329 megatons CO2e. And equally so, supporting the renewables and battery expansion capacity prediction to the 2035 contained in the IRP, with, of course, the need to understand coal utilization as well as specifics around the gas. And lastly, implement guardrails against for the utilization of coal and gas, as well as what is important is the emissions reduction measures in other sectors, so that it is aligned with the NDC emissions target ranges going forward. Thank you. I'm going to pause there, Commissioner.
Thank you, Simpiwe. That was a lot of information. You did very well to summarize it in the little time that I allowed you. So thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that there are comments and questions that are put in the chat or on the chat. So please continue to share your thoughts and your views there. We'll come back to the chat and see how we respond to some of those issues that you highlight there. I want to move us forward a little bit now to the next part of our webinar. This part is going to be made up of 5 presentations, 5 inputs from our social partners in this work on climate action in South Africa. Some of them, we know them very well. They are our colleagues in the commission. And I trust that you will help me with time management. I've seen your comment already, Louise, on the note. So, but please proceed. First is going to be Louise, and then we're going to have David after Louise. Louise, please introduce yourself and then proceed. You've got 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm going to show my face when you are at 7 minutes. So when you see my face, you must know that you've got 3 more minutes. Please proceed.
Perfect.
Please.
Thank you, Chairperson. And I echo your comments to the Secretariat for their presentations. So I'm Louise Naudé. I work for WWF South Africa, and I am a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Commission. So I just want to remind us, I want to start by reminding us why we need to do mitigation. And that is because of climate change impacts, and let us not forget that it is the poorest among us who suffer the worst from these climate change impacts. Let us think about those who have lost their lives in KZN floods, in Eastern Cape floods. And the HSRC did a study where they tried to quantify the loss to the economy over the past 2 years of extreme weather events. So this is not counting heat stress. It is not counting long-term droughts. It is not counting all other kinds of climate change impacts, just extreme weather events. And they say that cost the economy 113 billion over the last 2 years. So, let us just be mindful that mitigation and adaptation and resilience are 2 sides of the same coin. The more we mitigate, the better we can help prevent some of the worst of the impacts. So I just wanted us to remember that. So I want to speak about 4 things. I want to speak about ambition in our NDC, urgency of action, the economy, and justice. So, just be aware that every minute where we are pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from anywhere in the world, including from South Africa, makes it worse, makes climate change impacts worse. And it is going to take everyone doing everything to, as fast as possible, to, keep us back from accelerating and worse impacts. So that's about the level of ambition. Everyone doing everything that they can and that they should. Then the urgency of this action. So scientists have calculated, for every ton of greenhouse gas emissions that we emit, we push the temperature a certain amount. And therefore, if you sort of think back, okay, to stay below or stabilize at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees global warming, which is a global average, it will be hotter in, for example, Southern Africa than those numbers. But they've calculated back, that means we can only emit so much emissions before we'll start exceeding those temperatures. And they look at the likelihood as well. So for 50% chance of stabilizing at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the global carbon budget is today 235 gigatons remaining. And we will use that up. If we continue to emit at the levels we're emitting globally, we'll use that up in 6 years. So therefore, taking action is really urgent. So now, if we're willing to let ourselves go to 2 degrees global warming, where we are, running into even ever more serious impacts, then we have 1,110 gigatons left to emit. And at current levels of emissions, that will be used up in 27 years. So, that's my urgency point. It is really important to act urgently. So let me turn to the economy. Let me say this. There are people in the South African economy who would have us believe they set up a false dilemma between taking strong mitigation action and economic prosperity. It is not one or the other. And in fact, in Simpiwe's input, this idea that we must still allow ourselves emission space for the sake of economic development actually plays into that narrative. So, it's very clear from studies that have been commissioned by the Commission, the UCT study, but also the one done by Econometrics previously, which indicated that even if the rest of the world does nothing, which means, we can't do it alone. South Africa can't do it alone. If we act and nobody else acts, we're in for a dreadful climate future. But even if the rest of the world does nothing, just economically, it is better for us to act ambitiously. Yeah, so, this idea that if we put ambitious numbers, in other words, strong emission reduction targets in our NDC, that's going to crash the economy, I think is a false idea that is being set up. The day when companies come to retrench people because of the transition, the economic transition that is underway globally, of course, they will point to that number on the page and say that's the reason. But actually, the reason will be that a company is making risk-return calculations and profitability calculations and deciding to retrench people. It'll be an economic choice at that point. It will not be caused by the number on the page. I mean, it'll be a profitability choice. Okay, so I want to highlight two recent reports that I think very interestingly illustrate that there are differing interests at play here. The one is a report called Powering Up. It was commissioned by the We Mean Business Coalition, and it interviewed 104 business leaders of companies in South Africa which have over 18 million rand a year revenue, and astoundingly high percentages said that they want to see the country's electricity 95% of the companies interviewed said they want to see the country's electricity system phase out coal. 86% wanted to see that by 2035. And then they also said that they would relocate their operations or their supply chains to a different country which is more renewable, which has got more renewables in its mix, because it's a factor of business now. They're all trying to reduce their own emissions, reduce their scope 2 emissions from the electricity system. So it was 84% of those interviewed said they would exit South Africa. So, that's a very strong and difficult economic force. The other report is called the Obstruction Playbook. It is a report by Just Share, which is an NGO, and it tracks how the heavy emitting companies in South Africa have lobbied on the carbon tax and on the Climate Change Act over many years, and have weakened those instruments, which could have helped and could be helping transition our economy. So my last point is around justice. So I think strong mitigation targets in our, which are in the recommendations by the Commission, the draft recommendations, send a signal about where our economy is going to attract foreign investment and domestic investment and avoid a domestic disinvestment. And, I don't think that that's the problem. I think what the problem is that we haven't built in the justice strongly enough in our plans for this transition. And I would, call out that we really start to think about the justice dimensions. How will we deliver that justice? What does it constitute and what will it cost, so that we can raise the money for that, even just for the narrow part, not even the big transformative part of justice, the narrow part of, ensuring that workers in these industries are protected going forward and that it's not them that pays the price. So there's a country level, between countries, developing countries and developed element of justice, and there's a within country element of justice. And at the last Commission meeting, and this is my final sentence, Chairperson, we heard there was an Oxfam paper which said that it's the richest 10% of individuals in the world who have caused 52%, more than half, 10% of the people, the richest 10%, more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions over the period 1990 to 2015. And so there's a big inequality question here. Inequality between countries, inequality between rich and poor, and that's where I think our attention should go to. Thank you, Chairperson.
Wow. I'm impressed, Louise. Not only by the substance, but by your timekeeping. Thank you very much. I want to move on now to David. David, please introduce yourself, and you also have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. My name's David Jarvis. I'm from the Industrial Development Corporation, and recently been appointed as a commissioner to the PCC. So it's a space which I haven't been intensely immersed in recently, so I'm coming back into it. I think there's great strides which have been made in terms of how we are dealing with these issues. And importantly, looking at what the evidence points us to and what the facts say. So I'm going to focus just on one area, which is obviously the industry focus coming from IDC. And first, just to say that I agree with Louise, it is a false dichotomy to say that mitigation is at the expense of economic development. However, we do need to define what are ambitious targets, and that requires evidence. And smart targets do need to be achievable. And I think, just like I said, coming back into the space, I don't think enough progress has been made from industry side in terms of defining what ambitious targets will be within industry. So, as part of the Climate Change Act, the NDC does need to align with the sectoral emission targets and the national GHG trajectory, assigned carbon budgets, and other related instruments. And I think there is a challenge in terms of the provisions of the Act in determining sectoral emission reduction pathway targets, which hasn't been enacted. And so it means that the NDCs are largely top down. So when we're looking at the levels which we're setting here and the commitments that we want to make, I do think there's a missed opportunity in terms of developing this bottom-up approach. And it's something definitely, having just recently come back into the space and representing business on the commission, it's something that I think needs urgent addressing from the side of business. So I do need to say, though, that there's an element of caution that we need to be exercising as we set these NDCs that take into account the pace and affordability of the transition. So yes, ambitious, but also taking into consideration what is achievable in the near term. And we've all agreed it requires extensive investment in energy, transmission grid infrastructure, in battery storage, logistics infrastructure, and then how we need to migrate industry, in particular carbon intensive and hard to abate sectors. We need to grow green technology value chains and promote new industries within these value chains. So at IDC, we are playing a role in most of these investment areas, but it's important to note that it's not just about the funding. The development of green and low carbon projects, which are key for mitigation, have to grapple with numerous challenges, including the current operating environment, but particularly long investment cycles, the capital intensity of some of these investments, the ability to scale, the technology risks, and green premia, which exist. Never mind finding markets for these products and securing offtake agreements. So we do need the time to overcome these challenges, and any industry targets need to take this into account including the, what's practical in terms of reducing emissions based on current technologies and the technologies that are available. And like I mentioned earlier, green premier. So for example, we've done a lot of work in green hydrogen. We're years away from having price parity between green hydrogen and grey hydrogen. And some countries have introduced, guarantees of a fixed price for a product, and but this would require fiscal support, which we know isn't available within South Africa. So, for example, what they're doing in South Korea. Taking as an example the steel industry. So if you look at the pathway to emission reduction in the steel industry, it starts with energy efficient investments, and then the adoption of technologies that use less electricity, like electric arc furnaces. Then how are we going to power the electric arc furnaces with more renewable energy? And then moving finally into green steel, green DRI steel, green hydrogen, and looking at sustainable carbon inputs. So at IDC we're investing along these pathways. We've supported the growth of mini mills, for example, which use electric arc furnaces. We're assisting with shifting to renewable energy, and we're also doing pre-feasibility studies and moving towards commercialization of green hydrogen projects. But even those green hydrogen projects that are moving to commercialization are still well away, 5 years from application of green hydrogen. Then they would mainly focus on e-methanol and green ammonia, which are used for fertilizers and explosives. So the process is slow, and I suppose the issue really is around making sure we have the evidence base that supports the emissions targets we're setting up for ourselves. So we do need to, notwithstanding the fact that I did say it is a false dichotomy to say development, that setting ambitious targets are at the expense of development. However, we do need to make sure that we don't undermine our current reindustrialization efforts. The provisions need to take into account a bottom-up process. I know there was a preliminary analysis which was done by NBI on the various sectors, so that would be definitely a starting point. And like I said, this is the role of industry to develop these bottom-up budgets. So we are ambitious about and optimistic about the transition, the ability to achieve a transition, but we do need to take into account the timing of investments, and any targets would need to be set based on the evidence of that pace of that transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thanks for those inputs. We're moving on, colleagues. I'm now going to invite Francesca from the faith community. Please introduce yourself, Francesca. And after Francesca is going to be Nkosinathi.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry about the noise in the background. I'm here at Bonn at the climate change talks. And I tried to find a quiet corner, but the internet kept dropping. So I've come up to the noisy computer center where I'm plugged in. So I hope that's okay. And I'm going to proceed unless you tell me otherwise, Brian.
Please do so.
Great, thanks so much. So yes, I'm Francesca de Gasperis. I'm from SAPSI, the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute, and representing the faith sector here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, and here in Bonn, I'm at the climate change talks. It's the mid-year meeting that happens near the UNFCCC's headquarters, where there's many experts here looking at the more technical issues related to the climate commitments that we're making globally. So I've just arrived and it just started yesterday. But I'm really pleased to get this opportunity to be talking with you in South Africa, because that's our major concern. And obviously from our view as the faith sector, it's central to our work is this issue of justice and the issue of the historic reparations that are needed both globally and within South Africa. We know that climate change came as a result of industrialization and colonization, and those have had a major impact on the inequality that many communities still face in South Africa. And many of the faith leaders that we work with are representing communities who are deeply underserved and really excluded from this kind of issue. So I'm very aware of my privilege here speaking to you all, and I just want really that to emphasize the need to open up this space more and more, make it much more accessible, no longer look at consultation as a process in which we consult each other, but actually about bringing communities and those least served and most vulnerable to climate change right into the center to lead us in how we address climate change. I think this is absolutely critical. So how do we move forward in South Africa when we talk about the levels of responsibility and action, bearing in mind this historic injustice and looking at the new NDCs? And the need to mitigate is absolutely clear and not of discussion in terms of South Africa's responsibility. Despite being part of the global South, we remain one of the major emitters globally. And even though we didn't benefit as many of the other northern countries, and we're much larger than the rest of Africa in terms of our emissions, we must make the cuts. And I also want to say that we talk about Paris as if it was a wonderful achievement, but actually it's inadequate. It's 10 years ago now, and I want to critique Paris. At the time, we weren't happy with the Paris Agreement. 1.5 degrees increase in temperature is the absolute upper limit we should be aiming for. Already it looks like we're unlikely to meet it. And yeah, I think we should not look at the Paris Agreement as much as that's where we're aiming as being really sufficient, especially when we're looking at the needs of the communities in South Africa. And so we really deeply appreciate the technical work and the other presenters today. It's been excellent. We do feel that South Africa's mitigation ambition is insufficient, critically so, and it's actively undermined by government policy incoherence. And there's a lot still that can be done at this critical juncture. So I don't want to be too negative. I think the issue that we're seeing is that the current range is higher than what is considered South Africa's fair share, but we're not achieving that and below that because of we've been showing our ambition or achieving things. It's actually because of the stagnant economy and excessive load shedding. So that doesn't give us a lot of confidence. And also I'll go into a little bit more into the energy policy issues that we see as really being the massive stumbling block. Louise already gave us a good understanding of what it means in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide and the urgency. We also heard the business case for some of the actions that are happening. But this issue of this policy incoherence really comes out in the government's energy policies, as in the latest draft IRP. You'll see new fossil fuels, particularly large-scale gas and new nuclear, which we believe both negate the very mitigation goals that the NDC is trying to set. And some people don't understand why we bring new nuclear in here. Well, it costs so much and it takes so long to build. It really, what it does is it narrows the possibility of renewable energy and the investment, because we don't have that bigger fiscus, so we need to focus on renewable energy. And we believe that that really needs to be addressed if we're going to meet the ambition of our NDCs and the need for mitigation. And Louise also touched on, but I also want to mention, this terrible impacts of climate change that we're already seeing in South Africa. 90 people having died in the Eastern Cape just last weekend, and it's really scaring. The lack of infrastructure, the lack of local government preparedness. And that's why I'm saying really we need to go beyond all of those. That's all necessary, but also we need to help communities be part of the understanding and learn how to respond to extreme weather events so they can really take action if government's not able to reach them quickly enough. And also there's a member of the Climate Justice Coalition in the chats, Motlatsi, who mentioned the need for greater transparency and working so that the numbers of the NDC can be calculations are more meaningful and accessible, and also the need for greater community inclusion. And so I just wanted to bring those up here because I thought those were really good points. So what we're recommending is that we go beyond the current ambition. It should be the absolute minimum that we go to much lower numbers of carbon dioxide to be emitted. I think that, you know, even the low 300s is really, we shouldn't go beyond that, and we should make a very clear commitment. One thing I've learned working in the world, living in the world, is that if we don't give ourselves clear, strong commitments, there's no chance of us hitting that. So if we give ourselves a weak commitment now, we're not going to achieve it. And I think it's really important that we reject any false solutions to climate change, including new fossil fuel, as I mentioned before, and nuclear, but also unproven geotech. We see a lot of that coming up. People, even in the models, people will say, oh, carbon capture and storage is going to solve our problem. Green hydrogen, these are all still technologies that are underdeveloped. So I don't think we should pin our hopes on them or allow them to distract us from the real need to reduce our emissions, and while doing that, really build the economy to benefit all of South Africa. Definitely, we should not compromise jobs for mitigation. I think that's an absolute red line, but I do believe that the government, if it gives itself a strong enough challenge, can achieve that. So this very important area is this element of policy incoherence. We need a binding national commitment, and that must be halting all new plans for gas, oil, coal, and nuclear. And once we do that, then we'll stop the distraction in our sector and in government, because these energy systems are incompatible with 1.5. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that's not even ambitious enough. So yes, those must be abandoned, and they shouldn't be part of our energy mix anymore going forward. Let's take it seriously. We know that coal isn't going to disappear tomorrow, no matter how much some of my colleagues in the civil society sector advocate for that. The reality is we will need to have an energy mix. We talk about planning for the future, and that's what NDCs are about. So we want to see, you know, the reduction of coal and all fossil fuels, and it must be done over time. And that's why we say no new. So I think that's a very important point. That sometimes get lost in the arguments. People say, oh, civil society is not being realistic. And I actually think we have really good understanding of what's going on and what the best future would look like. And that's around planning, energy planning systems. I also want to say a little bit more, Brian, if I may, about the need to be inclusive and participatory, and the need to really go beyond consultation into meaningful participation, which is not just about inputs or asking people to contribute or separate stakeholder perspectives, but it's actually a substantive way in decision-making and also partners in the just energy transition. The reality is that to really mitigate, we need to be working not just top-down, but also from the bottom up. And we can see that emission targets and plans can be co-designed and implemented effectively if we start looking outside the box of the big policy levers. So, and then finally, I just wanted to say that I believe our mitigation ambition needs to be decoupled from the issues around the economy. And actually, it needs to be seen as an opportunity to positively impact the economy and look at it as something which can actually change how we go forward and create more jobs. I think we don't often talk about the jobs that would be lost if we allow climate change to continue. And if you look at that in comparison to job losses from sectors that are allowed to continue, you'll see that the benefits of a just transition far outweigh if we continue to business as usual. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Francisca. Thank you for making the time whilst you are in Bonn, and may you have fruitful efforts up there in Germany. Thank you for sharing with us your views. I just want to remind everyone that is here that We are taking note of your inputs. So after Nkosinathi, we're going to have Wahid. After that, we're going to open the floor for all of you to make comments as you wish. My point is that we are noting your inputs. Your contributions are helping us in drafting the report that will be the final report of the PCC's recommendations. So we're noting everything that we are getting here. Now I want to invite Nkosinathi. Is it Nkosinathi? Am I right? Yes, Nkosinathi Sibiya. Ukhona bhuti?
Yes, indeed, I am available.
Yes, please come in.
Yes. Greetings, everyone. My name is Nkosinathi Sibiya. I'm from Advocates for Climate Justice South Africa. Of course, to present on this day, a day after just the Youth Day of South Africa, the 48th commemoration, makes it a burden on my shoulder that I need to present the view that I believe is of the young people, and of course sharing it with the main organization that sits in the caucus of the PCC. Firstly, I think the day after we just commemorated the 48th anniversary of Youth Day, and we should honor the bravery of the class of 1976. But as a generation of youth today, we must ask ourselves, what does their legacy demand of us today? The students who marched against Bantu education weren't just fighting for better classroom. They were fighting for a future where young people could shape their own destiny. But 48 years later, we face another defining struggle, the fight for climate justice and just energy transition. The same spirit of resistance that fueled Soweto must now fuel our demand for meaningful inclusion in South Africa's climate future. As young people, we inherit a world of rising temperatures and vanishing opportunities. We cannot accept empty symbolism or token roles in the NDC 2035. How the recommendations might impact young people and society more broadly, the feasibility of implementing the proposed targets, and what support or enabling measures are necessary to ensure successful delivery are some of the questions that I will be trying to respond on. Of course, looking at expanding energy access and reducing energy poverty, job creation and youth economic empowerment, strengthening community resilience and climate adaptation, advancing a just energy transition, and also including the gender and social inclusion. Of course, we've identified some key challenges that are facing young people in dealing with the energy just transition. Of course, the access to finance, the policy barriers, the outdated regulations that often favor central utilities over community energy. The skills gap that exists within the transition as we cry foul of losing more jobs in the process of us transitioning into a better South Africa. But we, as young people, we believe that our inclusion in the current juncture will define the role that South Africa can play in the global scope. As South Africa develops its updated national determined contribution for 2035, it is imperative that young people are recognized as central actors in the country's just transition. With youth constituting over 60% of the population, their inclusion in climate mitigation strategies is not optional, but essential for long-term sustainability. The draft of the NDC 2035 presents both opportunities and challenges for young South Africans. On one hand, ambitious renewable energy targets and just transition framework could unlock green jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities in solar, wind, and circular economy sectors. However, significant gaps remain, including the lack of specific youth employment quotas in green industries, insufficient funding for youth-led climate initiative, and weak mechanism to ensure private sector accountability in skills development. For the NDC to truly serve youth interests, several enabling measures must be implemented. At the policy level, these include mandating youth representation in NDC oversight structures and creating tax incentives for businesses that hire young workers in green jobs. This is in a way to encourage these industries in order to have a meaningful voice of young people and ensuring that the voice of young people is amplified, whether in government or departments, even in private companies where young people and their voice needs to be heard. And also we must look at the education systems that need urgent reform to incorporate climate literacy and provide free technical training in renewable energy installation, climate smart agriculture, and green technology in order to avoid jobs being lost and further exacerbating the already existing challenges of inequality. Because if we respond to these challenges, it will mean that we capacitate young people even in order for them to redirect their skills even on the already existing ones on the job market, because failure to do so will cause more problems and will further exacerbate these challenges that we're speaking about. The financial support mechanism, such as a dedicated youth climate fund and grant schemes for community renewable projects, are critical to unlock youth innovation. The private sector must step up through apprenticeship programs and investment in youth-led climate tech incubators. Why are we for this idea? It's because we understand that decentralizing the energy sector will mean that there are community-owned organization projects and youth-owned projects that considers also the level of saying if these are socially owned, they will easily respond into the day-to-day challenges without considering the whole of economic and also allowing them the space to participate in the economic in building the economy of this country. The mitigation gap in youth engagement manifests most acutely in three critical dimensions. First, the energy transition component focus mostly exclusively on utility scale renewable projects, while ignoring the proven potential of decentralized youth energy solutions. Research from the African Climate Foundation shows that township energy cooperatives led by young entrepreneurs achieve more than 40% faster adoption rates of solar technologies compared to top-down programs. Why are we saying this? Because we understand that if these are owned by communities and they are owned by young people in the township, it is easy even to share the message across, because these networks of young people are already existing, but they are not utilized in the correct way. So if we capacitate them on skills and ideas on how this can achieve the reduction of carbon at a faster pace, is unpredictable, and it's something that we are citing that is backed by empirical evidence and research that has been there in the space. While creating localized economic benefits that multiply mitigation impact. Second, the industrial decarbonization and medium enterprises, which account for 8% of industrial emission, but could achieve 25 to 50% reduction through youth-driven efficiency innovations. We say this is undoubted. The more you empower young people that are participating informally and contributing into air pollution and many other aspects, you are actually extending a potential of reducing it by 25 to 50%, where we think that these, including young people, will ensure that these achievements are attainable at a shorter space and will be done at a faster pace. Thirdly, we must say the agriculture and land use components neglect the growing movement of young agricultural ecologists whose regenerative farming practices simultaneously sequester carbon, improve food security, and create rural employment. We say, let's empower these young people who are taking agriculture seriously and smart agriculture in order for them to say they will open job opportunities, create another avenue for the job that will be lost while we are integrating into a just transition. But favor to that, it will also improve the food security that is the threat into this country, because we are saying, in as much as we are responding to the problems, but let's look up into the opportunities muchly and empower our young people in order to respond effectively into these challenges. But we have a comprehensive youth integrated mitigation framework process that we propose, which is nothing less than a paradigm shift in South African approaches into emission reduction. The cornerstone is establishing youth climate zones where we feel like physical hubs combining training, innovation labs, and project incubation tailored to local mitigation priorities in coal regions like Mpumalanga. These will focus on repurposing mining lands of renewable energy and turning youth into decommissioning technologies. In metropolitan areas, they will drive building, retrofit, and circular economy starts up. Because if you look at the waste sector, is being neglected and is being ignored, yet it is one of the largest contributors into our carbon emission. So we must look at how do we do best in those spaces, and surely we can come up with something proper as young people. And in the rural areas, of course, we look at the focus that can be given into smart agricultural practices. And of course, the early pilots in Nelson Mandela have demonstrated that these zones can train 500 youth per site annually while delivering measurable emission reduction within the 18 months of establishment. The economic transformation potential of this approach is staggering. Our analysis shows that 15 billion annually in youth-led that can be invested in youth-led mitigation. Just 12% of what maybe the total mitigation price could create 450,000 jobs. direct job by 2030 while achieving 15 to 20% of emission reduction targets. This includes 150 jobs in renewable energy systems, which can lower the traditional cost as well, because look at the contractors that are already offering electricity, they are already giving it a higher cost rate. So giving this into socially owned companies, it could assist us even in lowering the cost of energy in our country. And we believe that there can be a job that can be created in the sustainable construction and retrofitting, as well as the regenerative agriculture. The multiplier effects in terms of economics tells you that this will extend far beyond direct employment, catalyzing entire new industries around green manufacturing, climate tech, and environmental services. The implementation requires fundamentally rethinking 4 pillars of our climate governance architecture. First, we must establish provincial youth climate council with statutory authority over 20% of mitigation budget and project approval. Second, the National Treasury needs to create innovative financing instruments like mitigation impact bonds, specifically for youth organizations. Thirdly, every sectoral mitigation plan should include mandatory youth employment and enterprise development targets. Fourthly, our monitoring system must evolve beyond technical emission metrics to track youth participation, intergenerational equity, and social co-benefits of mitigation actions. Implementation requires fundamentally rethinking these 4 pillars, and we must be clear on what we want to do if we want to achieve these ones. As we finalize the NDC 2035, we face a simple but profound choice. Will we continue with mitigation approaches that view youth as an afterthought and recipient, or will we embrace them as co-architects and leaders of South Africa's low carbon future? The science is clear that we need all hands on deck to avoid climate catastrophe. The economics shows youth-led mitigation delivers superior returns. The justice imperative demands we stop relegating young people to the sidelines of decisions that will shape their lifetime. This isn't just about tweaking policy language, it's about launching a generational movement that positions South African youth as global leaders in climate solutions while building the most inclusive and dynamic green economy on the continent. The time for half measures is over. The NDC 2035 must include a dedicated youth mitigation strategy with ring-fence funding, statutory at least 40% of youth representation in all climate governance bodies, a national youth climate corps with 500,000 positions by 2035, a robust measurement of youth contribution to emission reductions. Anything less would be historic missed opportunity and a betrayal of both our climate commitments and our intergenerational compact. South Africa's youth aren't just asking for a seat at a table. They are ready to build a better table altogether, if only we provide the tools and trust they deserve. The question is whether our leaders have the vision to recognize this. The stakes could not be higher. By failing to properly integrate youth into mitigation strategies, we risk not just missing our emission target, but losing an entire generation's trust in climate institutions. The 2023 South African Youth Climate Survey revealed that 73% of young people believe current climate policies exclude them, while 68% are ready to lead mitigation projects if given proper support. These numbers represent both a damning indictment of past failures and an extraordinary reservoir of hope and potential waiting to be tapped. It's only with young people, together with young people, that a better future can be planned. But we fully support the draft recommendation, and where necessary, we are willing to contribute effectively as young people of South Africa into shaping the future, which is green and that is full of hope and a better economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nkosinathi. Thank you for those inputs. There's a lot there that you said that I truly agree with. I'm going to invite our last contributor for this afternoon, Wahid. Wahid, please introduce yourself and please take the floor.
Thank you, Commissioner Brian. My name is Wahid Hussein. I'm also a commissioner on the PCC, but I'm also representing the social partner Labour. I hail from a federation called FEDUSA, one of the vice presidents, and also the general secretary of HOSPERSA, which is a trade union in the public sector and in some extent the private sector, private health, conservation, etc. So that's where my strengths come from. All right, so I've been asked to do a brief presentation on the Labour's input in terms of the NDC recommendations, which we've already dealt with to a fair extent or large extent at the PCC and also on a previous platform. So by and large, as Labour, and I speak on behalf of Labour when we sit there, although we have got other constituencies who represent other federations and other parties, but by and large, the NEC recommendations have been fully endorsed by us as social partners in NEDLAC. Now, obviously, we take full comfort in the fact that when it comes to climate change and the effects of climate change, that South Africa is doing its part as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned. And we are taking the matter seriously, because I don't think we need a science degree to see what's happening around South Africa, around the provinces, and around the world. So certainly the NEC, NDC, and the PCC, and all climate change, stakeholders that are doing something with regard to climate change, it has to be done. We can't, we just cannot accept that we just sit and do nothing, because the impact is being felt by everybody, not just workers, but also by communities and the vulnerable. So obviously, on any new program, any exercise that one undertakes, there's going to be ways that one needs to find its feet, but or find, as you learn as you go along. But certainly, we as Labour, we always seem to do the forecasting of the impact certain things will have on the workforce, the workforce, Labour, the workers at the end of the day, because that's our primary objective, that's our primary role, is to safeguard jobs and to ensure that we avoid at all costs the loss of jobs, especially in South Africa. We know that the unemployment rate is very high, especially among the youth, as we've heard now. Over 40% of youth are unemployed, and certainly in the active working population as well, there's a large unemployment rate, and we cannot afford to lose any more jobs, whether it be through the effects of climate change or any other matter for that. We cannot just lose. We cannot just ignore the fact that jobs have to be secured and jobs have to be protected. So as much as we roll forward. Obviously, one of the things we have raised at the PEC is the issue of a just transition, and it has to be a just transition, not a unjust transition, especially when it comes to workers, because we do understand that there's going to have to be transitioning of workers, especially in the mining industry. We've seen in the coal industry already the impacts of transitioning, which was not thought through properly. We have the report now from the Commodity Port exercise that was undertaken, and the closure of the mines in Mpumalanga, and obviously the effect on workers, the retrenchments that took place. So we obviously don't want a repeat of that kind of exercise. As much as Section 189 of the Labour Relations Act is a provision to deal with when you talk about retrenchments or operational requirements, but certainly it's got to be done in a just manner. And even Section 189 sets out a rule book in terms of how an employer is to go about when they are faced with transitioning or restructuring or operationalizing a workplace. So we want to see a just transition in everything that is related to climate change, and that's why we are also a partner on these platforms. Now, one of the things we spoke about is if workers are going to be facing the issue of transitioning, especially coal or the motor industry with EVs, etc., there has to be some sort of skilling, reskilling, training programs that need to be introduced by employers before these things can start taking effect, because it's no use when it's on our doorstep, then we start to put in plans in order to mitigate the effect, the consequences. It has to be done early. If we know that we're going to be moving towards a program of, transitioning in a certain workplace or a certain component of a workplace, we need to start introducing programs, because we know that, yes, workers, they will actually accept that they need to transition or transform the workplace, but that they have to be taken along as well. The theme that's being used now is leave no one behind, and we certainly don't want to leave any workers behind when it comes to the just transition plans that we have on the table. Now, one of the things we spoke about, obviously, is and a lot of emphasis has been placed around the energy sector, because we know that's going to be the most impacted, transitioning from a very carbonized carbon platform type of economy with our electricity demand to a greener energy source of electricity. That's going to have a huge impact on our coal industry and other industries that rely on the coal industry and the mines. We certainly know that, yes, moving towards solar and wind and other types of energy is going to there are going to be opportunities, but certainly those miners that are working in workplaces where they rely on certainly on those type of industries are going to be hugely affected. So we would like to see the transitioning of those workplaces, and we be taken along as labor in those areas as well, because usually in most instances workers are organized in those areas. So we don't want to see the unemployment rate escalate by effects of climate change when we are talking of transitioning workplaces. We know that certainly the catastrophes that are taking place, the floods, etc., is going to have, and that's something that I wanted to raise at last week's meeting, because certainly energy security is a critical issue when we're talking about the NDC's recommendations, and certainly with regard to a just transition. But equally, we have to factor in things like food security, because the impact of climate is having an impact on our food security. So our agricultural sectors, our agricultural unions are being affected. Seasonal workers are being affected when we have we have a change in the climate, which we are not prepared for. And certainly those sectors need to be captured into the whole work stream when we're looking at the energy transformation, the energy sector transitioning, because certainly food security is part of that sector. They also rely heavily on the energy sector for a lot of things. And certainly when the energy sector has been transformed or transitioned, the food security sector needs, or the food agricultural sector needs to be part of that process. We are also seeing currently that the impact of the economy, the world economy, the geopolitics and globalization is having on the motor industry. We've seen recently the tire industry is being hugely affected by Goodyear closing down in the Eastern Cape. And certainly we've seen the threat of big brands like Mercedes-Benz and BMW threatening to downsize because of the impact of, we know, yes, it's largely impacted through sales, but certainly it's also impacted through the, the hybrids and electric vehicles that are coming through the system, which is reducing production in terms of the transitional vehicles that we normally would be accustomed to, and which we at our plants in the Eastern Cape, KZN, etc., have usually relied on the assembly units. So certainly we need to look at how do we deal with the mitigating factors of reducing the impact on those sectors, because the motor industry is going to be one sector that's going to be hugely affected over the next few years, even the next few months, in terms of how they are going to be transitioned from obviously the effect of lower sales. So certainly the unemployment aspect is going to find its way one way or the other through those processes. And as we talk about decommissioning of coal plants, there's going to be also decommissioning possibly of some sectors, areas in the motor industry, and that needs to also be factored into these recommendations, because it's going to impact on these recommendations one way or the other. We've seen the Komati Pool report, and obviously we don't want to make the same mistakes again, although I've been a new commissioner on the PCC, but certainly there's a lot of work that's gone into the previous commissioners, and certainly we don't want to have a happening of the Komati, because we know the impact. Workers that have lost their jobs in that sector are finding it very difficult in order to find their way back into the world of work. We must talk about the work of the decent job portfolio, and any job, any creation, or any transition must be on a decent work program. And we have to obviously look at funding models, something critically that we spoke about going forward. There has to be some sort of funding models that need to be very carefully looked at, because we may have very successful ambitions, or very thought through ambitions, but certainly if those are not part of some funding structure, it's going to struggle to get through to the ultimate goals which we want to achieve. But certainly from our side as Labour, we know we got to do this. We got to hold hands with the employers, with business, with government, and with the civil society, because this is something that's close to us, and it's going to impact on all of us. And at the end of the day, we want to be part of a solution and not just come with problems. So certainly we are here to also contribute to the ultimate achievements of the workshop and this webinar, and also of the work that the climate change programs are going to be rolling out. Thank you, Chairperson, and I hand back to you, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wahid, for the clarity in your input. Colleagues, I want to thank the colleagues that have made inputs to date for your brevity. You've helped me with time management. We've got about 25 minutes of Q&A. After that, I'm going to hand over to Lebu for the closing remarks. So I request that you raise your hand and introduce yourself, remind us where you come from, and then make your input. And I'm going to ask Simphiwe to assist me with finding questions or hands rather. I see there are 2 hands already, 3 now. So we've got Vincent Gololo, Kabonina, and Clement. Let's start with you, Vincent. Welcome, nice to hear from you. Come in.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. My name is Vincent Gololo. I'm with my marine company. So I have 3 comments and 2 questions. My first comment is the issue of misalignment in terms of the policy. I'm worried that, remember the presidency deferred some sections of the Climate Change Act, in particular the ones that deal with mitigation and adaptation. Now, the ones that deal with mitigation, in particular Section 25 until Section 26, they deal with setting goals for emission reductions and then the sets and then carbon budgets. But then here we are doing work which is almost similar to that in terms of NDC, although it's on a short-term base, but then it's indirectly doing this very same objective of those sections of the Act. And then you wonder who's doing which work and how is the country going forward in terms of mitigation. Other colleagues have already mentioned the IRP, the one that is not that is being currently in a drought for, and there are also some. It does not necessarily align to the work that the NDC is currently trying to do in terms of the emission reduction. So that is just a comment. But then the 2 questions that I have is on the target. I mean, it's the requirement that when you have such a policy direction, you need to do the socio-economic analysis, particularly the costing part of that policy. I just want to understand if PCC has done that work and what will be the costs of the targets that the PCC is actually recommending. That is 1. 2, the important stakeholder, Dr. Brian, for this workshop or for this engagement, the industry is not here. At best, I think the Department of Energy should have been here so that we can also hear their views. Because we know in South Africa, when you're talking about mitigation, it's literally your electricity industry, which is government owned. It's like it's all of us, but they're not here. They didn't provide their input. So I think it was going to help next time so that you have that balanced view as to what are they doing. I know in some meeting they were there presenting the work, but I think for this session, it was going to be helpful as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Vincent. I note that I'm going to ask Simphiwe to respond to some of the questions that you've asked. Kabonina and then Clement. After Clement is going to be Nomonde. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, Bob Matlana. So my name is Kabonina and I'm the climate and energy specialist from WWF South Africa. I just wanted to state that there was neglect in mentioning waste management and waste reduction within Simphiwe Ngwenge's presentation. So I wanted to confirm with regards to waste management and waste reduction, are we going to include within our NDC targets means of using certain types of waste and landfill to waste to create energy? Because I understand that the city of Ekurhuleni uses part of their waste management practices is using methane extracted from landfill to create energy. So that's just one of the things that I wanted to confirm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sis. We're noting your comment. We've got Clement, and then I've got Brandon. After Brandon, it's Richard. Clement, please come in.
Good afternoon, Doctor. Thanks for the opportunity to share. Am I audible enough?
Yes, we can
My
hear
name
you,
is
sir.
Clement Mwepudi from Grassroots for Climate Action in Gauteng. I would like to comment on the challenges of mitigation, because our NDC don't reflect the challenges of mitigation, because already we've got the dual economy where we've got the developed and the underdeveloped areas, which creates a despair in our access to resources and opportunities. And also we've got an inequality, which is a major challenge to achieve the mitigation. And also climate change impacts already recently in Eastern Cape, you can see other departments don't want to be accountable. And we ask the DFFE and also the minister to come, like the ex-minister, Ms. Mbogoto Epapa Chris, to attend these meetings, because they are relevant for him and his department, so that we need capacity in all these departments, especially the DFFE, because now we are a fossil dependent economic country. We need to transition, because the transition framework is there for us, but we don't follow it. Also, our climate governance is very poor, needs more capacity, is very poor, because we've got our Climate Change Act, but we don't implement it. I don't know, other people, they are here to serve their political interest. We don't want that moving forward, because we are the champions of the framework, because we need power to enforce the mechanism. We don't have a point from the PCC as view due to DFFE. DFFE is holding PCC's powers. But now we need the resource constraints to end, and we need the data availability. We need the data to be available to all the grassroots community before the people. But now we also imply that people's power is renewable energy, but the community renewable energies projects are not going to the right people, which as us, the grassroots level. And the last challenge is the water scarcity. We can't say other people must mitigate without having taps, without having it. That's a social economic inequalities. We have to address those. And lastly, our gas emission trajectory is not explicitly defined as a single range, because we are using 2025, 2021 trajectory. We don't have the plan for 2035. Now we have to be careful, because under the Paris Agreement outline, the peak, plateau, and decline strategy and trajectory, we must use it, because they will say, so they say the emissions will rise in 2025 until 2035. We have to be careful in doing this, because this is for the country. It's not for us only the civil society, but the most impacted people are the grassroots communities. Thanks. We have to consider that in our NDC. Thank you, Doctor.
That's very clear, Clement. Thank you. Thank you for your inputs. Brandon and then Richard. After that, I'm going to invite Simpiwe to start the responses. Please come in, Brandon.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few quick points in support of maintaining strong ambition. Just from an economic point of view, it doesn't make sense to minimize the mitigation ambition. And we've seen in the draft recommendation that modeling shows that diluted emissions reduction targets don't yield net economic benefit past a certain point. And as Louise mentioned, the Cambridge econometrics modeling demonstrates net economic benefit. Weaker targets enable fossil fuel lock-in, and I'm thinking here particularly of energy in terms of delayed coal decommissioning and widespread baseload and mid-merit gas to power. increasing CBAM type risks and locking to stranded assets. Additionally, gas to power will likely negatively impact electricity prices over the mid to long term. And I'm not sure these socio-economic impacts are always taken adequately into account. It's actually mentioned in the ESRG that air quality and water impacts are not adequately modeled, but just to say that these are increasingly being understood and accurately costed, and pressure, including litigation risk, is mounting for compensation and health impact and water conservation mitigation measures. Unnecessary fossil fuel lock-in will displace renewable energy capacity and climate-smart industrialization, such as that envisaged by SAREM, which are far more future-proof directions for the economy to move into. And then diluted ambition will compromise access to climate finance, which we know is already at risk given global developments, and there's stiff competition from other developing countries that are embracing decarbonization. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Brandon. We're going to have Richard. I request that we take in and listen to Nomonde before going to Simpiwe. So we're going to have Richard and then Nomonde Madubula. Richard?
Good afternoon, and thank you for this webinar. And yeah, particularly great to hear more open discussion of how some things that have been treated as trade-offs traditionally are no longer trade-offs, but rather have synergies, as both Commissioner Nordia and Brandon reiterated. Mine's question really around electricity particularly. I've made some more general comments in the chat that I trust go on the record, but it is good to see the PCC recommending consideration of adjusting the 2030 target in line with the most recent climate science, because the top of that is too high. Should be somewhere below 400, not above. But in this regard, the question is, and this is remarked on the PCC's NDC recommendations, where it says, what does it say exactly? The impact of the implications of coal and gas utilizations assumed for IRP were not clear. And surely this should be a call to clarify those, not just to 2030. I saw just earlier today that Eskom presented to the Commission at a meeting on Friday about their plans, and we've been waiting for a long time to hear about what they think their emissions trajectory is going to look like, etc. So provided that we don't do anything really silly in terms of a mandate to keep operating coal-fired plant that is killing people when we could be replacing it with renewables, Eskom was aiming for 125 megatons in 2030. Have they provided any clarity in their input to the PCC last week or elsewhere on where they stand now, given that they haven't actually come back to us since they said that's what they would do? So that should allow for us to reduce the target in 2030. When it comes to 2035 and future scenarios, again, so much of both the credibility of the target we put there, as well as how much we do to act to avert future harm, rests on what we do with the electricity system. So if they have given any indication, that would be great. And otherwise, just to encourage the PCC in continuing to engage on this, to really insist that we get greater clarity about that, because it seems like there's efforts to secure a mandate for emissions from electricity that are not conducive with socio-economic benefits of the majority or the whole of the economy. So anything that we could hear about Eskom clarifying its position, or when that might happen, because it really needs to happen to inform a decision on the NDC. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Nomonde.
Thank you, Dr. Mantlana. Good afternoon, colleagues. I just wanted to perhaps comment on Usimpiwe's presentation. On the industry sectors, she mentioned those three, and I was wondering about the waste sector. I think someone mentioned it, as well as the agricultural sector. Is it perhaps a reason that they were left out? And it reminded me of the report, the mitigation report by the DFFE in, I think it was in 2014 or 15. Is there any cross reference to that? Because that report, it also perhaps, if I make an example on waste, it does perhaps estimate or the mitigation potential perhaps for the waste sector up to 2050. It has 2020, 2030, and 2050. So I just wanted to check if perhaps that report is, because I remember she was saying that it has been updated. Did they also cross-reference with the mitigation report that was released by the DFFE sometime, I think 2015 or so? Thank you.
Thank you, Sisi. Simpiwe, may you please come in? I request you keep it brief. I would like to have another round of questions. So if you can take us for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. Before I start, I want to note that this particular webinar focuses on mitigation. This forms part of a series of webinars. The adaptation components, I understand the importance of, particularly the impact around agriculture and some of the financing elements. But I think that, the webinar around means of implementation will give us an opportunity to do a deep dive around some of the questions that stakeholders have, just so we can do them justice. I do want to note that with regards to our report and some of the driving factors, it really is some of the market forces, as well as employment, particularly employment opportunities, especially some of the vulnerable sectors. For example, that's why we mentioned transport, because of the transitional pressures around policy from our trade partners. And I think it's important to consider that because whilst we can control the pace of the transition, but there are also external factors that really drive how quickly we do transition or how slowly we do transition. With regards to power, again, we have made specific emphasis on power because it all hinges on renewables. If we can green our electricity generation in our grid, it really enables the sustainability of certain industries, if not most industries, and economic activity. And so that's why it is important. And so I concur that weaker targets could impact particularly trade. And weaker target, what they do is that they also open us up to the reliance of technologies that aren't mature yet in the future. So, for example, carbon capture and storage. Whilst they are important technologies, they might not be able to work for all the sectors. And so we have to think up strategically how we allocate the usage of those technologies. There was also a question around the DFFE and the role of the DFFE and some of the work that they are doing. So the PCC is an advisory body. We do, Lebogang mentioned that we are making recommendations to the DFFE on this process. And so with regards to the work that we are doing now, they have taken the approach to really just, be on the other end and be on the receiving end of the recommendations and the work that we are doing. I do want to speak about waste management and waste reduction because it has come up quite frequently. So we acknowledge the importance of waste management and waste reduction. We've got a longer report. So this recommendations report forms part of a suite of documents. There's a technical report as well as a stakeholder report that we are in the process of refining and finalizing. It goes into the details of the different sectors. We have not really been very specific about waste management within the recommendations report because our focus, whilst it's extremely important, especially in terms of the co-benefits that come from managing waste, such as employment creation as well as methane, and of course contributing to mitigation. We have focused on those sectors that really are catalytic in terms of how we reduce our emissions. And so even though carbon capture and storage is very important for waste, but I think that for waste, what is really important is implementing the waste management hierarchy and ensuring that we're consuming less and therefore really wasting less. And so I think I've covered most of the questions. There was Richard made recommendations around electricity and this being a call to clarify gas implications. The PCC has been involved in the NEDLAC process, and I think some details that may not have come through here were actually expressed within that process. I do want to bring in particularly Brett and Emily with regards to, there's a question around the UCT work or the ESRG work, mentioning that anything beyond 10 gigatons is a no regret option. But I want to state that after having done the analysis and obviously the assumptions, Brett can go into the details of that. That doesn't factor in some of the trade impacts, the climate impacts, the physical climate impacts, as well as other externalities like air quality, as well as political pressure over time. And so that's why you'd find that, anchoring on a 9 gigaton carbon budget culminates in significant economic growth, as well as new economic opportunities, and even access to preferential finance and some trade. But please come in around that point, please.
Thanks very much, Mpiwe, and I think you have actually answered the question, and it also ties into what Brandon said earlier on. So the 10 gigatons is no regret. 8 and 9 do have some implications for GDP, but when one takes these other factors into account, then there could definitely be sort of equivalent in terms of impacts on economic growth and GDP. So it brings the different budgets closer together. The reason why the 8 and 9 gigaton budgets were chosen was that these are best aligned with the fair share, or our understanding of what fair share might be at this point. So and those are the best numbers that we have at this point. There's not a lot of modeling data out there which shows exactly what South Africa's fair share numbers should be and what the links of those are to particular temperature goals. So we've drawn on this sort of state of the art of the modeling at the moment. I think maybe, Simpiwe, if I may, I can answer Farida's other question, is that, in fact, what these models do is they do actually optimize for, pace and affordability of the transition. So they certainly take into account the costs of implementing different mitigation actions, and so show trajectories that are aligned with these carbon budgets that give us the lowest impact on GDP. So that brings in the whole pace and affordability thing. And it does indeed demonstrate what Richard has been alluding to, is that the energy sector or the electricity sector is the primary target for mitigation within the next 10 years, which is the period covered by the NDC. Yeah, so hopefully that answers those questions. Thanks, Mpiwe.
Thank you. Thank you, Brett. I see Kira. Please come in, Kira. But I just want to remind Simpiwe that there was a question on costing the targets and the invitation of Department of Energy to this webinar. But before that, Kira, please come in.
Thank you so much, Brian, and appreciate the opportunity. I'm Kira Irwin, and I'm based at Groundwork, an environmental justice NGO. I just want to have one last point, I think, for consideration around the waste sector, and caution for it not to be seen as something separate in how we address the fossil fuel industry or petrochemicals. And it's important to see how integral it is, in fact, to the arguments in those industries for being able to continue to extract. So the fossil fuel industry has 3 major profit streams. Of course, energy is huge, but so is the production of plastic, as well as the production of agrochemicals. And I worry that if we don't put waste in as a key sector, what might happen is that you're going to see increasing diversification within those industries, pushing for profit margins linked to plastic and agrochemicals, both of which have really detrimental effects on climate change as well. So it echoes a call for more ambitious targets, but I'm also requesting that we think about how these things are integrated and how we are creating ambitious targets. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kira. That's very clear. Louise?
Thank you, Chair, for giving me another bite. So I think that's, you know, some things that Commissioner Jarvis and Commissioner Hussein said are really important to pick up on. And I must say, I am encouraged to serve with such commissioners who really apply their minds here. But you know, this question of the carbon budget for the country. So, you know, we allocate ourselves a certain budget between now and 2050, at which point we hope to be net zero. And so for me, the really important conversation is how should we use that budget? And that goes to some of the stuff that Commissioner Jarvis was raising, because Commissioner, you were speaking about the really hard to abate sectors, you know, which are important for the economy, like cement. You know, how do you build houses without cement? Well, there are some alternative materials, but, you know, we need those industries for iron and steel. We need them. And they are, you know, it will really take time and effort to decarbonize them. So we have to keep a big piece of our carbon budget for those industries, and we have to early do the things that are low-hanging fruits and do them rapidly and in a deep way, you know, and that speaks to things like the electricity sector and so on. So, you know, I think one of the most important projects that's happening in the country at the moment is being done by the DFFE. They asked this question. They said, what is a good life for South Africans? What does that look like? And then how are we going to use our carbon budget, you know, which is a shrinking resource, to deliver that good life? And I think that it's really important that we stop contesting high mitigation numbers in the NDC and in other documents, and really start having the how conversation. Okay, we know we have to get there. So how? What is the sequencing of things? What must we keep our carbon budget for? What must we use it on?
Sorry, Louise, I'm looking at time.
Okay, I'll stop there. I just think that really what we need to start having is a conversation around a roadmap. Thank you.
David, I'm sympathetic to your hand. I apologize, Commissioner. You and I are going to work together for the next 5 months, so I have enough time to apologize in person. I need to hand over to Lebohang to round off today's webinar. Please come in, Lebohang.
Thanks, Commissioner. And thanks to the colleagues that have joined this very interesting, thought-provoking webinar. And it's just that time is the enemy of progress here. So we can't actually get into a lot more than what we've been able to do in this limited amount of time. But just to say to colleagues, some of the questions that were raised around, costing related to the targets that we're proposing, to please join us tomorrow. We will be having another session specifically focusing on the means of implementation. So how do we go about moving from the actual targets that we're proposing to their actual implementation? So to please join that session where we can fully interrogate some of these questions and get into the substance of it. So just to quickly talk to issues related to process as I've indicated, we are finalizing our thematic webinars with the means of implementation webinar tomorrow. So colleagues, please do join us. And we still have a process of public comments on the NDC recommendations draft that the PCC has put out for public comment. And we will be closing this on the 23rd of June at 11. So we kindly do request you to refer to the PCC's website and to send all your comments to mitigation at climatecommission.org.za. We are slowly but surely proceeding to the finalization of this work, but having followed such a stakeholder intensive process to achieve public comments, we do invite various quarters to please make submissions, and we will be preparing to submit to the DFFE as they prepare their draft for public comments, and we will also host a final colloquium where we hand over the final recommendation. So thank you to everybody that has joined today's event. We have had really important reflections that have come out from today's session, and we look forward to seeing you in further engagements with the PCC on this work on the NDCs. And special thank you to our commissioners, as well as to our chair, Commissioner Brian Mantlana, who has led this session very well on our behalf. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Bye.